guys, Dr. Gabrielle Fondero here, RP Nutrition Coach, and I want to give you just a short video on some practical applications that you can use to best support gut health and mitigate some of the GI distress that's commonly associated with exercise, especially endurance exercise. I also want to go over a list of fecal fallacies, basically just some myths and some topics in gut health that receive a lot of press but really aren't evidence-based, and hopefully save you some time and money because some of these things can get really expensive. So first, what are the things that we want to emphasize in a diet when we're thinking about gut health? I don't think that I can emphasize enough the importance of fiber and whole grains and complex carbohydrates. There is a ceiling to fiber intake. It's pretty high. If you're getting upwards of about 70 grams or so of fiber per day, you're probably going to have some gastric upset. But general recommendations fall within 25 to 40 grams of fiber per day. And really, if you're eating whole grains and vegetables at every meal, it's actually not hard to meet that recommendation. Remember, fiber is fermented by certain bacteria that can use it to produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which is hugely beneficial. Of course, they can also produce gas. And so if you do have, issues with gas and things like that, there are some other considerations that I'll get to on the next section on what we might want to limit. You could also add some fermented or cultured products to your diet. Things like yogurt, kefir, kimchi, kombucha is really hot right now. Those can all contain actual live beneficial bacteria. In most cases, they're also going to be labeled as containing live active cultures, and they'll give you the list of the bacteria that are contained in that product. Not all things that are fermented are going to contain live active beneficial bacteria. So for example, like alcohol, red wine, in moderation would be healthy, but that's not something that we would consider to be a probiotic drink. Similarly, if something's been pasteurized, like pickles or sauerkraut that you would usually buy in a grocery store, there may be small levels of specific bacteria in there, but ideally, those manufacturers want to control the bacterial content of those because there are bacteria that will grow that we don't necessarily want to be growing in food. So those aren't going to be considered probiotic foods either. So don't think that pickles or sauerkraut anywhere is going to be considered to be probiotic. That's not necessarily the case. Also, be aware that if you're preparing these things at home, you might want to just be careful about the production of these items because, like I said, we can actually have some pathogenic bacteria that grow even in refrigerated conditions. For example, listeria is a pathogenic bacteria that actually grows really well in anaerobic cold conditions, so like in vats of ice cream or yogurt. So just something to be careful of, especially because raw milk is really popular right now, that we want to control the growth of pathogenic bacteria. And so manufacturers have really great safety precautions in place. Not to say that you can't produce these things at home. You absolutely can. Just be aware that there's a little bit of an increased risk of perhaps foodborne illness if you're making them yourself. Another thing that we want to emphasize is healthy fat content in the diet. So remember, I'm not trying to demonize fats in any way, and as long as we're adhering to the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges and American Heart Association recommendations of less than the 30 or 35% of fat from the diet, then we're going to be fine. In most cases, we're getting plenty of omega-6 fatty acids, but a lot of us aren't getting enough of the omega-3 fatty acids. Now, these are really best when we get them from animal origin. So when we're looking at, fatty fish or perhaps krill oil. You can get these also from plant sources like walnuts, flax, and chia, but we have to convert the form of the omega-3s that are in those products, and so the turnover isn't really as efficient as if we're getting them from animal sources. Also consider replacing some of your animal proteins, perhaps with plant proteins, especially if those plant proteins, you can also, trade out some of your carbs as well, because in most cases, our plant proteins come with a dose of complex carbohydrates and fiber. So that's another way that you could do, perhaps meatless Mondays, and, switch out one of your animal protein sources. Interestingly, there is a study done on cricket protein powder that showed that that was actually bifidogenic. So if you want to, explore the world of insect proteins, that's another option that you could look into. Now, if you want to supplement with a probiotic, I would say that, there's evidence to justify the use of a probiotic to help relieve some symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome or inflammatory diseases. So if that's something that you want to try, there are a few things that you want to look for on that label. For example, we want to make sure that it's potent enough, and it looks like in most cases it needs to be multiple strains of bacteria and at least 1 billion CFU or colony-forming units. Another important thing that you want to look for is a label that indicates that a third party has tested that product for purity. So United States Pharmacopoeia, or USP, is one example. You might also want to look for an NSF label if you're an athlete, because that indicates that it's been tested for banned substances. You may also look for GMP label, good manufacturing practices. You can also check out some websites that evaluate supplements as well, and just make sure that you're getting something that has been tested for purity. We can't, there's no laws that require that testing to be done, and there's nothing to be said about testing for efficacy or effectiveness and safety, but at least if you find one that's been tested for purity, you know that it contains those strains of bacteria that are stated on the label, nothing more, nothing less. Now, what are the things that we might want to limit in our diet? Certainly, it's prudent to limit our dietary fats to less than 40% of our caloric intake. I know that the ketogenic diet is really popular right now, and certainly it can be useful. It's a useful tool for controlling weight or even achieving weight loss. That being said, there have been human studies that have looked at a hypocaloric ketogenic diet, and it did reduce levels of beneficial bifidobacterium, perhaps because the fiber intake was very low. So if you want to do a higher fat, lower carbohydrate diet, I still recommend taking a soluble fiber supplement, because most of the veggies that you're going to be eating are going to be higher in insoluble fiber. But by taking a soluble fiber supplement, perhaps you can mitigate some of the loss of those bacteria that really need that soluble fiber. Another prudent recommendation when it comes to fats, limiting saturated fats to less than 10% of your caloric intake. Saturated fats are another topic that have been sort of placed on a pendulum. They went from being really, really terrible and we shouldn't eat any to they're super great and we should eat all of them. There's still plenty of evidence that saturated fat intake is linked to cardiovascular disease risk. So I say we still want to go ahead and limit that. Artificial sweeteners and refined sugars in moderation. Refined sugars have their place intra-workout and post-workout, pre-workout. That's totally fine. So it's not to say that we have to completely remove them from the diet. They do have a place. Artificial sweeteners also have a place. And we know, based on human studies, not just rodent studies, but if you watch the video on diet and the microbiome, it's safe to say that very, very few people will experience any effects from the use of artificial sweeteners. Perhaps about 1% of people will see changes in insulin sensitivity, or we may see a transient change in the microbiome if we're taking artificial sweeteners in at high levels. Now, when it comes to sugar alcohols are actually included in FODMAPs. And remember, those are fermentable fibers that can tend to lead to the production and accumulation of gases. So sugar alcohols can actually make you feel really gassy and bloated and even have a laxative effect. Other FODMAPs that are pretty commonly problematic for people would be things like garlic and onion. I know that is a bummer because those are really flavorful and delicious, but it's just something to consider. That remember, I said that fiber is great, but at the same time, some fibers can cause some people to have gastric distress. That's one thing that you want to determine for yourself. You can do a very brief FODMAP elimination protocol and then start to add foods back in. Another common FODMAP that's really problematic for a lot of people would be lactose. A lot of individuals are lactose intolerant, and if you happen to be, then that's something that you would need to limit. Although most people who are lactose intolerant can still tolerate Greek yogurt and some cultured dairy items, but that's something that you just have to kind of test out for yourself. Now, when it comes to training, we know that, exercise has had reproducible beneficial effects in humans. But at the same time, there is sort of a dose dependence there, and we can have, too much of a good thing. So when it comes to especially endurance exercise and ultra endurance exercise, we want to make sure that we're periodizing our training properly. Recently, we've gotten into this mode of more is better, and we want to exercise until we puke, and volume for the sake of volume. And there are ways to work more efficiently and to use your time more wisely. So when it comes to just pounding the pavement or the weight room floor without a periodized approach, you may actually be doing more harm than good. So you want to make sure that you're incorporating low intensity and moderate intensity training. Give yourself time to rest, sleep, and recover, because your gastrointestinal tract really does appear to take a beating when you're doing really intense endurance exercise. Also, super important to maintain that you're properly hydrated and fueled during your endurance events. We have seen that it's beneficial to take in a carbohydrate beverage during exercise, so a 6 to 8% carbohydrate beverage. That can help reduce markers of intestinal permeability. Some limited studies have also shown that perhaps taking a probiotic supplement chronically can also benefit endurance athletes. Now, on to the fecal fallacies list. Gut health is such a hot topic right now. So a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon. They're developing supplements and gut health protocols and coaching just specifically on gut health, and recommending all sorts of crazy detoxes and cleanses and who knows what else to help heal the gut. I am very pragmatic and practical, and I try my best to be an evidence-based practitioner. It's not that I don't think that gut health issues exist. They absolutely do. But my approach is just more minimal and more evidence-based, in that I don't like to throw a bunch of stuff on the wall and see what sticks. I'd rather take things away and then add back in and try to figure out what the culprit is for someone's gastrointestinal issues. So one of the big things right now is talking about dysbiosis and either diagnosing it or curing it. Remember, I've said this in other videos as well, there's not one single profile for dysbiosis. Just like we can't have a single cure for cancer because there are many different forms of cancer, there's not one single cure for dysbiosis because there are many different forms of dysbiosis. So that's one red flag. If someone's saying that they can either diagnose or cure your dysbiosis, that's really not possible. Another thing, rebuilding the microbiome. Some people think that because they went on antibiotics or they've had gastrointestinal issues or were ill, that the whole microbiome maybe is gone, or it's just really messed up or irreparably damaged. That's probably not the case. When we look at these longitudinal studies or observational studies, we find that the gut microbiome is actually fairly stable. And even if we do throw some crazy things at it, taking antibiotics, starting an exercise program, changing our diet, once that stimulus is removed, it generally will go back to baseline. Now, there are some exceptions to this, and there are some exceptions to us wanting it to go back to baseline. If you were infected with a serious pathogen and then want a long stretch of antibiotics, then yeah, you may have some lasting effects to the microbiome. But based on recent research, it's not necessarily ideal to take a probiotic once that happens, because it's actually been shown that the probiotic supplementation may delay rebuilding of your gut microbiome. In some cases, it may be better to just wait it out, get back to what you were doing previously. In other cases, it may be better to take an autologous fecal transplant. So it sounds really kind of crazy, but yes, it is actually ingesting prepared fecal matter from yourself. You can also have a fecal transplant from another individual who's healthy. It sounds a little bit crazy, but these have actually been shown to be really effective against some harmful pathogens like C. diff, which is a really virulent, usually hospital-acquired infection. That being said, you really can't tear down and rebuild the entire microbiome like you would with a house. You certainly can make a dent in it, sometimes bigger or smaller, depending on the influence. But anyone who tells you that they can help you rebuild your microbiome, there's no evidence for that either. So things like healing the gut, or curing leaky gut. This is really popular too, especially when it comes to supplements like collagen and glutamine. Now, both collagen and glutamine are really essential for those intestinal cells. It helps them maintain tight junction proteins, and we know that that's really important for preventing intestinal permeability. That being said, we don't have deficiencies of either of these things in the diet. Collagen is really high in glycine, which is a non-essential amino acid, and glutamine is the most abundant non-essential amino acid in the diet. So taking more isn't going to be of benefit. There's no evidence to show that it's beneficial to humans or that it does any of these things that people claim that it does, like healing the gut or curing leaky gut. Now, we can test for intestinal permeability through a couple different mechanisms. So yes, increased intestinal permeability does exist, but it can be a transient thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's increased pathogens in the gut or that you have a chronic leaky gut. And we haven't established a cause and effect relationship between intestinal permeability and obesity. There's a link there. In some cases, people may try to convince you that you can't lose weight or that you're gaining weight because you have a leaky gut. And they've also implicated in a bunch of other disease states. Not to say that we don't have links between dysbiosis and other disease states, yes, but once again, this is not something that you can really diagnose as you have a leaky gut and we're going to cure it. Detoxing or cleansing the gut, I mentioned this in my video on diet and the microbiome in the supplements section. Detoxing and cleansing can actually be harmful to the gut. In most cases, these programs are going to increase your risk of diarrhea. They can have a laxative effect, so they're going to increase gastric emptying time and increase transit. Neither of those things are going to be good for gut health or for the microbiome. Also, you don't need a detox. Your liver and your kidneys help remove toxins. That's the whole purpose. Taking a detox, in most cases, people can't even explain how it's going to work. They can't explain what toxins. The detoxification of lipopolysaccharide, for example, happens enzymatically in the liver. So taking a supplement is not going to detox you. The last couple I've also mentioned in my video on diet and the microbiome, again, talking about supplements. These aren't necessarily supplements, but they are things that people might want you to purchase. Those are the IgG food sensitivity tests and the electrodermal food sensitivity tests. I've mentioned before that there's actually, these IgG food sensitivity tests have never been validated. They've never been proven to actually do what they claim to do. And the presence of antibodies does not indicate that you have an allergy or even a food sensitivity. It just means that you have been exposed to that protein in the past. And actually, in some cases, the presence of an antibody means that you won't have any reaction to that food and that you will be able to manage it just fine. The electrodermal food sensitivity tests are actually just based on the galvanic skin response. So it's just how conductive your skin is. Basically, are you a little bit sweaty or not? This is basically like a magic 8-ball for food sensitivity tests. And so a person can just, look at the sensors and say, oh, you're sensitive to cashews. And then who are you to argue with them if they talk to you about how all this cool newfangled stuff actually works? It does not have any capabilities of determining a food sensitivity. Likewise, there are other things that people might sell, like copper rings or things like wearables that indicate food sensitivities or that will increase gut health. No evidence for these. And in fact, there's evidence that that type of food sensitivity testing does not work at all. So just keep an eye out for that. Now, finally, dysbiosis has been implicated as perhaps a cause for the inability to lose weight. Now, there are certainly a lot of factors that can make weight loss more challenging, but dysbiosis itself, because it's an umbrella term, can mean a lot of different things. And at the end of the day, what causes weight loss or weight gain are shifts in energy balance. Now, certainly you could have a gut that increases energy harvesting from the diet, and so that means that you may need to eat less than a person who has your exact same dimensions. That's just the reality of it. It could be harder, but it's not impossible. Another thing to think about is that because dysbiosis can take many forms, you could have a dysbiotic gut that actually makes it hard to gain weight or that makes you lose weight. So just saying that dysbiosis is a cause for obesity really is sort of a misnomer, and it could become something like a scapegoat. So if someone is perhaps making claims that dysbiosis is a cause for the inability to lose weight, there's really no evidence to support that statement either. And it's just the reality that some of us may have to eat less and may have to work a little bit harder in order to lose weight because we're really efficient at harvesting energy from the diet. So I hope you guys like those practical take-homes and some things to watch out for. I know because this area is so new, there's so much information out there, it's really hard to sift through, that it's hard to tell what is an evidence-based approach. Plenty of practitioners probably have really great intentions, but the evidence doesn't lie, and you need to make sure that whatever you invest in has a solid justification and solid base of evidence, because otherwise you're wasting your time and your money. So I hope you guys found that helpful. If you haven't checked out the other videos yet, please do. I've got a video that introduces the gut microbiome and talks about how we measure it. I've got another video on the relationship between diet and the microbiome, and another video on the relationship between exercise and the microbiome. So put them all together and you've got a nice little blurb of information on how to best support your own personal gut microbiome.